12. The Talking Q Language and Psychoanalysis. Introductory remarks. Lacan sees in Edgar Allan Poe's tale The Purloined Letter an uncannily perspicacious illustration of certain aspects of his psychoanalytic theory, which in most respects is so well adapted to his purposes that it might have been written expressly to suit them. He hints, however, that it is precisely insofar as Poe was not consciously expounding a psychoanalytic theory that he unconsciously and therefore all the more accurately arrived at certain psychoanalytic insights. I shall offer a brief synopsis of the tale below, with the caveat that Lacan scrutinizes many of the apparently extraneous, but psychoanalytically significant, details I shall have to pass over in the retelling. In examining his interpretation of this story in his seminar on the Purloined Letter, I shall focus first on his demonstration of how Poe's tale, which involves an intentional and illuminating engagement with the necessary components of any tale, a drama, its narration, and the conditions of that narration, one illustrates the structural interrelations between the orders of the real, imaginary, and symbolic. In his seminar, he capitalizes on both the literary metaphor and the ambiguity of the story's axial motif, namely, the letter which allows for the play of multiple metaphorical manipulations, to demonstrate that these orders can and must be understood in linguistic terms. This accords with his insistence on the fundamental importance of a linguistic theory in psychoanalysis and undergirds his call for psychoanalytic theory to situate Freud's fundamental 348 concepts in a field of language and to order them in relation to the function of speech in his words. I would assert that the technique cannot be understood, nor therefore correctly applied, if the concepts on which it is based are ignored. It is our task to demonstrate that these concepts take on their full meaning only when orientated in a field of language, only when ordered to the function of speech too, as many commentators have noted. Then, Lacan's so-called return to Freud may be characterized as a reminder to analysts that psychoanalysis remains at bottom the talking cure yet, because he revises the linguistic presuppositions that underpin Freud's basic concepts to take account of structuralist and more contemporary post-structuralist developments. His emphasis on the role of language in psychoanalysis simultaneously constitutes an important revision of Freudian theory. 3 Accordingly, an important thread in the complex theoretical web he weaves around Poe's tale is that 3 unconsciously occupied subject positions, constitutive of the symbolic order, impose specific discursive points of view on individuals, which condition the conscious narratives by which they aim to recount the drama, or synonymously, the event. 4 I shall argue here that these 3 logical orders of signification that constitute the conditions of the narration can be described easily enough in the familiar terms of Derrida's plural logic of the agraria. Having laid out Lacan's account of the structural interrelations between the real, imaginary, and symbolic, as illustrated in Poe's tale, I shall turn to his analysis of the logic governing the displacement of an individual from position to position, and the consequences of such shifts. Again, Poe's tale might have been written expressly for the purpose of examining 3 important interrelated points. 1. One may discern an initial progressive movement from a position of ideological blindness through transgressive insight to analytical insight. 2. In this movement, occasioned by the eruption of an event and the associated motivating force of one's desire for mastery, there is a kind of intersubjective relativity at work, which places forward/displaces individuals in relation to one another. 3. One may also discern a strange reverse logic of retrogressive slippage in this movement, or a kind of blindness associated with every form of insight, which again has to do with the force of one's desire for mastery. Turning finally to the application of this theoretical edifice to the question of psychoanalytic intervention, it is clear that for Lacan its efficacy depends on the psychoanalyst's grasp that the fundamental question of mastery underpins both the principle of unconscious structuring and the logic of displacement in the intersubjective network. As I shall explain in more detail, the insight that he derives from Poe's tale is this: to the extent 349 that one misrecognizes analytical mastery as being a matter of power over others, rather than the self-mastery that is the precondition for ethical action, one retrogresses to the subject position of blindness represented by the king. This is the form of Lacan's warning to all analysts, institutional or otherwise. This warning concerning mastery and the questions it poses will guide the concluding remarks of this study. Clearly the risk of retrogression is ever present. Can one ever be vigilant enough as an analyst to prevent analytical mastery from devolving into ideological mastery? Perhaps one can, in principle, with ruthless and interminable self-analysis. More pointedly, does Lacan as analyst rise above this risk and withdraw from the retrogressive movement that drives the symbolic circuit more successfully than his counterpart in the form of Poe's character C. Auguste Dupin? Derrida evidently does not think so. An assessment of this opinion will form the conclusion of this study. Synopsis of Poe's The Purloined Letter. Poe's tale is constructed around 3 scenes, the second and third of which are in many respects repetitions of the first. 5 The entire tale is told by an unnamed gentleman, a friend of C. Auguste Dupin and admirer of his impressive expertise in solving enigmas. 6 Who happened to be present at the time of a visit from the prefect of police. The prefect wished to consult Dupin about a troubling affair in the royal household. The first scene then, narrated by the prefect of police, involves the intersubjective relations between a triad of figures, the king, queen, and minister. The queen, initially alone in the royal boudoir, receives a letter. While its specific contents are never revealed, the reader is nevertheless informed that the king's knowledge of this letter would compromise her honor and safety. Taken by surprise upon his entry, she has no time to hide the document and, in a ploy that depends on the inattentiveness of the securely ensconced, places the letter, openly, albeit face down, on the table. At this point, the minister enters, from whose links no detail escapes: the letter, the handwriting of the author, the king's oblivion, and the queen's discomfort. Astutely assessing the situation, he contrives, under the queen's fearfully silent gaze, to place one of his own letters, similar in appearance, next to the one exposed, and eventually to effect a switch. Having purloined the queen's compromising letter in front of her eyes, the blackmailer's power he wields over her, which he soon begins to use for political purposes, lies not in the employment of the letter but in the threat of this that its possession poses. The queen, unable to reclaim 350 her letter openly, entrusts the task to the prefect of police. Aware that the nature of the intrigue compels the minister to keep the letter very close at hand, he embarks on a minutely painstaking, ostensibly secret search of the minister's premises by well-trained police agents, over many months. Moreover, the minister has been waylaid on several occasions for a supposedly random body search, and undoubtedly expecting more of the same, clearly does not carry it on his person. The prefect confesses to Dupin that despite the extreme urgency of the task and the very liberal reward offered for the recovery of the letter, all searching so far has been in vain. Not without first extracting a careful description of the letter, Dupin merely advises the prefect to search again. The second scene is narrated by Dupin about a month later, after another double visit from his friend, the narrator of our tale, and the despairing prefect, whereupon, to the astonishment of both visitors, he produces a checkbook and offers the prefect the queen's letter in exchange for a very liberal check. The prefect does not wait for the explanation that follows, from which one may discern another intersubjectively related triad of figures, namely, the prefect, proxy for the queen, who mirrors the king's state of unawareness, the minister who faces precisely the queen's predicament, and Dupin, now mimicking the minister's links. Dupin grants that the police could not be faulted within the limits of their modus operandi but argues that the measures they used were entirely unsuitable for the case in question, which required a more flexible, poetic kind of reasoning. He enters into a lengthy assessment of the conditions that underpin the prefect's instrumental, mathematical, approach to the task of recovering the letter and, emphasizing that the minister is both mathematician and poet, the minister's poetic approach to hiding it. 7 He reveals that his own success in uncovering the minister's ploy lay in his ability, like a boy playing the game of odds and evens, to mirror the minister's intellectual style and thereby arrive at the correct conclusion. That the minister, wise to the skills and limitations of the rule-governed police mentality, must have risked placing the letter in full view as the best way of hiding it from them. Armed with dark glasses and the complaint of weak eyes to conceal his surveying glance, Dupin paid a visit to the ministerial quarters, finding the minister at home in a state of feigned boredom and lethargy. Simultaneously conducting an animated conversation with his host on a topic guaranteed to quicken his interest, Dupin, under the cover of his glasses, carefully surveyed the apartment, his eyes finally coming to rest on his quarry, apparently carelessly thrust into a pasteboard card rack hanging just beneath the mantelpiece and conspicuously different from the letter purloined from the 351 queen in every detail but size. Having committed these details to memory, Dupin took his leave of the minister, contriving, however, to leave his snuff box behind. Armed with a facsimile, he called for it the following day, having prearranged for a commotion to occur in the street below, so distracting the minister sufficiently to allow him to make the switch. Soon thereafter he took his leave of the minister, but not without leaving a trace. When the minister takes up the letter in response to the Queen's defiance of his blackmailer's demands, he will discover therein a citation, a line from C.R.E. Billen, so baleful a plan, if unworthy of Atreus, is worthy of Feist's, written in Dupin's hand, with which he is familiar. Although also acting as a partisan of the Queen, this parting gesture establishes Dupin's theft of the letter as an act of revenge for a past disservice at the hands of the minister. It is this clue that provides Lacan with the material for detecting a third scene in the tale, involving another intersubjective triad of figures, again displaced one position along. This triad consists of the minister, now mirroring the unawareness of the prefect and the king, Dupin, who takes over the Queen's position from the minister, and Lacan himself, whose position as interpreter matches the investigative position previously occupied by Dupin. Real, imaginary, and symbolic. In Lacan's seminar on the purloined letter, the drama, a synonym for the impossible real for Lacan. The letter in post-tale in the first instance stands for the thing happening or drama which occasions, in the form of the tush, the tale in the first place. These notions can be taken as synonymous with the earlier examined notion of event or trauma, all of which serve as markers for what Lacan has called the impossible real. The letter's equivocal status as event is brought out graphically in post-tale by the fact that his readers are never enlightened as to its specific contents, but are nonetheless left in no doubt that it bears no innocent greeting and represents instead a transgression of the established order, such that in simply receiving it the Queen's honor and safety are compromised. As Lacan notes, love letter or conspiratorial letter, letter of betrayal or letter of mission, letter of summons or letter of distress, we are assured of but one thing, the Queen must not bring it to the knowledge of her Lord and Master. 10 In another synonymous term, Lacan also names the letter the pure signifier. 11 That initiates, tush again, a chain of signification, that is, a 352 chain of attached signs, all of which aim, without the prospect of complete success, to explain or account for the signifier retroactively. Lacan insists that, as is the case with all events, the materiality of this letter, or pure signifier is anomalous or odd. In his words, if it is first of all on the materiality of the signifier, the event, that we have insisted, that materiality is odd, singularly, in many ways, the first of which is not to admit partition. Cut a letter in small pieces, and it remains the letter. It is Lacan is invoking here the impossible, immortal wholeness, oneness or singularity belonging to an as yet undetermined thing or singular. It happens this singularity of the unspeakable has no measure. In his words, the signifier is a unit in its very uniqueness, being by nature symbol only of an absence. 12 What kind of an absence? The letter as pure signifier or event symbolizes the absence of the kind of specifiable, measurable, determinable content, the present central concept or set of conceptual relations that would supposedly preexist, initiate, anchor, and order its subsequent linguistic interpretation. Yet the absence of such an anchoring or transcendental signified, implied by the term pure signifier, cannot be conflated with an absolute absence in the real. This would open psychoanalysis to the charge of subjective idealism. One must therefore remain wary of formulations that insist too one-sidedly on the absence of content. Certainly a particular content is never revealed, but we are left in no doubt at all that this is no innocent thank you note from a beloved granddaughter. As Lacan points out, the event is also not nothing. It signifies that something importantly transgressive happened to initiate a chain of significations, all of which vainly attempt to reconstruct, in retrospect, what happened. This is why, as he notes, one cannot say of the letter that it is either present or absent. We cannot say of the purloined letter that, like other objects, it must be or not be in a particular place, but that unlike them it will be and not be where it is, wherever it goes. 13 In other words, whenever the letter reaches its destination, it will simultaneously be and not be there. 14 The narration is a function of the imaginary order in a move that makes deciphering his text quite tricky. Lacan insists in addition that the word letter also stands for the language by means of which the singular letter or epistle received by the Queen, the event, is thought, interpreted, constituted, spoken, or narrated. The word's double duty, one should grant, emphasizes that there are no uninterpreted events. Again, the interpretation of an event is anomalous. An event is constituted 353 as such both by means of its interpreting recognition and due to the failure of such recognition, and this is always a matter of a linguistic narration that necessarily both gives it measure and fails to take its measure. The aporetic anomaly, then, lies in the unavoidable consequence that an event is simultaneously constituted and lost in its narration. As Lacan notes, language delivers its judgment to whomever knows how to hear it, through the usage of the article as partitive particle. It is there that spirit, if spirit be living meaning, appears, no less oddly, as more available for quantification than its letter. Again, the narration, in fact, doubles the drama, event, with a commentary without which no enscene would be possible. Yet, he adds, nothing of the drama could be grasped, neither seen nor heard, without, dare we say, the twilighting which the narration, in each scene, casts on the point of view that one of the actors had while performing it. There is no event without its narration from a particular point of view, but, as the word twilighting suggests, 15 It is precisely because narration must occur from a point of view that the event is both illuminated and obscured, framed and missed, by means of the narration. Something happens, but to establish what happened requires a retrospective, linguistic construction, a necessary fiction that is the product of the imaginary order, whose nature is such that the event is covered over the moment it is disclosed, or enclosed within certain boundaries, which means that what happened remains undisclosed and ever open to interpretation. So far, then, the relation between the real and the imaginary may be understood in terms of the relation between the so-called pure signifier, event, and the aporetic dis/order imposed upon it by the necessity of its narration from a particular point of view. The conditions of narration as determined by the symbolic order. Lacan argues further that the points of view that provide the conditions of the narration for the conscious speech that aims to narrate the event, or attach a signified to the pure signifier, are generally unconscious. By making a distinction between the narration and the conditions of narration, he ties the analytic dialogue to the important structuralist distinction between parole, actual, conscious everyday speech or linguistic phenomena, such as gestures, and langue or language, which, synonymous with the terms discourse or language game, refers to the unconscious infrastructure behind conscious linguistic phenomena. 16 According to Lacan's symbolic order is, at a first degree of approximation, 354 the background system or language that makes possible and meaningful the wide variety of human behavior. 17 Following in the footsteps of Claude Lévi-Strauss, who argues that forms of human behavior can be, indeed, must be, studied as analogous to utterances, these behaviors making sense only in relation to a background system of rules, which can be thought of as the language of such behaviors. 18 Lacan's notion of the symbolic order as constituted by three constant subject positions incorporates the insight that a social bond or intersubjective linkage is essential to make particular speech acts possible or meaningful. In short, Lacan's notion of the symbolic presupposes the predominance of the symbol over significance or value in the mathematical sense where, for example, x and y can take on any value but are themselves related in certain ways according to certain structural laws that do not change whatever the value they can be taken to represent. Each subject position imposes certain conditions on the narration, regardless of who narrates and what is narrated, and to the extent that characters occupy one or another of these subject positions, they manifest the power and weakness of the point of view it imposes. To the extent that a subject position is passively or unreflectively occupied by individuals and remains unconscious, their speech becomes what he describes as undirected, automatic, innocent, or empty. Empty speech denotes what is said without thinking. On Lacan's definition of the repetition compulsion, to shift to a different subject position, as post story illustrates, is unconsciously to fall under the spell of the narrative style imposed by that position. In other words, what is repeated in different characters is the unconscious subject position that conditions their narration. At this point there is little to suggest that Lacan's theory avoids being a version of discursive determinism, which is based on the assumption that we are entirely spoken by discourse. To demonstrate how Lacan escapes this charge requires a brief explanatory detour. He accepts Saussure's well-known dictum that language or discourse is an articulated system of differences without positive terms where any term takes on meaning because of its relations with other terms. On a structuralist account, the system of differences that constitutes a discourse is indeed seen as thoroughly relational, but the relations are taken to be ordered and stabilized by some form of anchor, an ultimate or central transcendental signified or principle or set of rules or relations. As already noted, Lacan's thinking both adopts and subverts structuralist principles. He grants that all discourses, from the more particularized and localized to the most general, are built upon presupposed, implicitly desired points de capitam that serve to orient the speech acts within them. 355 Here, he proposes the metaphor of a musical score. There is in effect no signifying chain that does not have, as if attached to the punctuation of each of its units, a whole articulation of relevant contexts suspended vertically as it were. From that point 19 the ultimate point de capitam, as Lee explains, may also be described as the point of convergence which allows the retroactive and prospective situating of everything that happens in this discourse functioning as a transcendental signified. The point de capitam is taken to be the condition that underpins what is in play in the signifying chains of a subject's discourse. The Lacanian subversion occurs with the insight that the points de capitam, for which the phallus is a general term, remain traumatic. In Lee's words, the phallus is present beneath every signifier as the signifier that has been repressed, and as such every signifier is a metaphor substituting for the phallus. 20 Notably, however, and this is the twist, the phallus is a word that stands for the impossible jouissance. The phallus, Lee adds, serves to signify that fullness of being, that complete identity, the lack of which is the fact of our ineluctable want of being. 21 Thus the points de capitam are not actually present in the signifying chain at all. Rather, replaced in the chain by other signifiers serving as metaphorical substitutes, or symptomatic disguises, for them. They serve only to mark the assumption of an underlying meaningful coherence, which retains its orienting function only if left unexamined. For Lacan, then, to explicate the sense of any discourse is to bring to light the points de capitam that have been repressed by that discourse, that is, its unconsciously presupposed transcendental conditions of possibility, or, one should add, quasi-transcendental conditions of possibility / impossibility. Psychoanalysis, in his view, through careful attention to the analysand's discourse, seeks to uncover the unsaid within the signifying chain itself, which nevertheless constitutes the meaning of that discourse. 22 What underpins speaking as such is a drive to regain the lost jouissance, which manifests in different ways. We speak as a demand to the other, not for something, but for an impossible recognition of our desires. But desire is metonymy, that is, a desire for something is a projection of the death drive toward jouissance. 23 In other words, desire itself can never quite be articulated, it is already an interpretation of the jouissance that slips away in the moment of truth. No matter what an individual speaker demands, it can only be articulated as an object that might satisfy need. The desire for recognition is masked by and thus alienated in one's demand for something. 24 All attempts to articulate desire are in vain and see the subject slipping from one signifier to another. Each of these signifiers is linked metonymically to the want of being, which the desirer hopes will be filled by the 356 others reply to his demand. 25 It is only the other's total recognition of the absolute power of my demand that will restore the lost jouissance, masculine death drive. Alternatively, it is only the other's recognition of the falsity of all discourse that will restore the lost jouissance, feminine death drive. Further, to the extent that all of our speech is a metonymic attempt to cover over this fundamental want of being, the trauma, all human speech is figuratively linked to the phallus, designating lost jouissance as the central point de capitam of our discourse. 26 This twist ensures that the background discourse makes individual speech acts both possible and impossible, both meaningful and incapable of full meaning. If my discourse is underpinned by the demand for recognition of me as a meaningful whole, it will turn out to be a restrictive prison, a pariah of limit. If it is underpinned by the demand for freedom from such restriction for the sake of including all, it paradoxically puts me in the prison of exclusion, a pariah of unlimitedness. If my discourse is underpinned by the acknowledgement of the part that functions as a whole, then I have to accept the aporetic nature of all experience, a pariah of paradox, reflected in statements such as the following: in order to be just I have to apply the law, but in applying the law I cannot be just. In order to be ethical I have to make a decision, but in making a decision, I cannot be ethical. In order to invent myself, I have to establish an identity, but in establishing an identity, I have to submit to convention. In order to be ethical I have to persevere with my project to the limit, but if I am unwilling to give up my project, I cannot be ethical. The phallus, then, contrary to structuralist principles, names an excess to the linguistic system, which produces paradox. It takes little ingenuity to propose that when humans try to say what happened, the different kinds of achorias in which we find our narration inescapably tied up are associated with points of view that may be described in the familiar terms of the plural logic of the achoria or in other terms. The most general discursive rule or quasi-condition of discourse articulates the achorias of limit, universal, limitlessness, particular, and paradox, singular, universal. This means that the position from which anyone speaks is auto-deconstructing. In a patriarchy, as noted, the logical articulation of the symbolic order takes on the characteristic form of the masculine and feminine death drives and feminine sublimation. In his interpretation of post-tale, accordingly, Lacan demonstrates that it differentiates these three subject positions in terms of an interplay of blindness and insight that corresponds respectively with the masculine aporia of limit, metaphysics of presence, the feminine aporia of transgression, antimetaphysics, and the feminine aporia of paradox, quasi-transcendental thinking, that describes the position of the analyst. 357 represented by the king in the first scene, the prefect of police as the queen's proxy in the second, and the minister in the third. The masculine point of view, which one could call the moment of blind faith in an established ideological order, involves a glance that sees nothing. 27 Such blindness takes different forms, as should become clearer in due course, but they all boil down to some version of the metaphysics of presence. As represented by the king, who does not see the letter at all, the blindness of his position is the consequence of erroneously converting the anomaly of the real into fully present terms. In other words, the king represents the kind of subject who interprets anything that happens only in terms of the grid of relations provided by some or other existing order and does not grasp that there is a non-evident background language or discourse that conditions any narrative. A narrative from the subject position represented by the king misses even the possibility of the enigmatic anomalies that occasion events. Thus, precisely because he misses the very form of the queen's transgression, the king sees nothing amiss, which leaves him open to being duped by the transgressor who sees more than he. The feminine glance, represented in the first scene by the queen, in the second by the minister, and in the third by Dupin, is, in Lacan's words, a glance which sees that the first sees nothing and deludes itself as to the secrecy of what it hides. 28 This characterization condenses two important moments associated with the feminine subject position, namely its progressive moment of insight, which is also that of transgression, and its retrogressive moment of blindness. Discussion of which I shall defer to the next section. Lacan ties the moment of insight to the eruption of an event. An event by definition is a traumatic interruption of any established order, regardless of the kind of transgression or the particular order transgressed. For Lacan, then, receiving the letter can stand as a metaphor for acquiring a certain kind of insight into the conditions of narration which would amount to acknowledging the non-natural, discursively constructed, fabricated, artificial, man-made nature of any system of law. This is an insight that immediately places the one who acquires it on the outside of, or at a reflective distance from, not just the contingent order of this particular king but from established order as such. 29 To see the letter as an event, then, is automatically to occupy a transgressive position vis-a vis any established order. Notably, to recognize an event in a patriarchy is automatically to occupy a feminine subject position, which is by definition transgressive in relation to a masculine subject position. 358 It is fitting, then, that the first to receive the letter in post-tale is the queen. As Lacan notes, the existence of the letter situates her in a symbolic chain foreign to the one which constitutes her faith. This incompatibility is proven by the fact that the possession of the letter is impossible to bring forward publicly as legitimate. 30 The queen's insight illustrates what Lacan means when he remarks that the displacement, but one could also add the placement, of the characters that people post-tale is determined by the place which a pure signifier, the purloined letter, comes to occupy in their trio. 31 In other words, a kind of intersubjective communication operates whereby a character's occupation of the transgressive subject position upon receiving the letter, which entails her or his recognition of the real, the event, lack, or castration, in turn relationally constitutes others as blind subjects. Here, the queen's recognition of the letter as an event, which by definition reconfigures the fabric of the world, immediately places the king and those who along with him do not recognize the event in the position of the blind or innocent who remain tied up in the net of existing relations. The occupation of an analytical position, which is a more sophisticated way of receiving the letter, or recognizing the event, constitutes both the masculine and feminine positions as still tied up in the imaginary. 32 The analytical glance sees that faith in the established order and its transgression represent two opposing logical moments or subject positions inscribed in the symbolic order. If the king's blind masculine glance converts the anomalous real into pure presence, the queen's perceptive feminine glance involves an equal but opposite misrecognition of the real, which converts it into a pure absence. She seems unable to envisage anything to replace what is for her, on receiving the letter, the shattered order of the king. From her point of view, there is only the artificial order and the sign of contradiction and scandal constituted by the letter. 33 In this subject position, then, conditioned by the background discourse of hysterical resistance to all restricting boundaries, the queen remains paralyzed. 34 Even if she had the power to modify or replace existing structures, from this subject position she is constitutionally unable to find any cause worth fighting for, since one is as much a fake as any other. Moreover, unwilling to risk her honor and her life in open subversion, her only option is to hide the transgressive insight and pretend to play the game by the king's rules. This, however, leaves her silenced, for she remains subject to an order she does not acknowledge as legitimate. Lacan notes that the double bind of her position is that her only recourse if she wishes to have her possession of the letter 359 openly respected is to invoke her right to privacy. But this is the very right that is not granted to those who commit a felony, such as treason. 35 As he sums it up, this sign is indeed that of woman, insofar as she invests her very being therein, founding it outside the law, which subsumes her nevertheless paralyzed within the king's order as its mere negativity. She has but to remain immobile in its shadow, yet, in hiding she leaves herself vulnerable to the analytical glance. 36 According to Lacan, the analytical glance, represented by the minister in the first scene, Dupin in the second, and Lacan himself in the third, is a glance of reflective distance and self-consciousness that sees that the first two glances leave what should be hidden exposed to whomever would seize it. 37 In other words, wise to the anomalous real and the conditions of narration, including its own, what this glance sees is that the first two are related according to the fallacious complementarity of the veil of alienation. What one finds in their relation is a lose-forward/lose situation of equivalent blindness rather than a lose-forward/win situation of blindness and insight. The analytical glance finds in this awareness the opportunity to rise above the paralyzing limitations of both Navi realism and its secret transgression and gain thereby the power of decisive action. In post-story, this analytical awareness is converted into the chance for larceny, and in a certain sense such action would always have to be criminal. 38 One should note, however, that the opening allowed by the analytical gaze equally gives one the chance for ethical action, and the difference between these two kinds of action is crucial if one is to see in the tale an allegory for psychoanalysis. I shall return to this important point in due course. As Lacan sums up so far, one can read post-tale in terms of three moments, structuring three glances, borne by three subjects. 39 But there is more to the logic of the symbolic order than the constant structure of subject positions incarnated each time by different characters and the progressive logical movement toward insight from the discourse of the king, through that of the queen, to that of the analyst. As Lacan points out, one may detect in the shift of characters in the three triads a strangely retrogressive logic of displacement. The twist in the tale, the desire for mastery and the logic of retrogression, the retrogressive slip from transgressive insight to blindness. How does the queen of the first triad slip in the second triad into the position of blindness characteristic of the king? Or, how does one slip 360 into blindness having once received the letter? The queen's new blindness cannot be precisely the same as the king's, because there is no return to innocence once transgression has occurred. It will be, instead, the self-delusion specific to one who has shaken off any Navi faith in the metaphysics of presence but unwittingly allows it in through the back door. In other words, if the masculine glance as represented by the king involves the kind of blindness associated with the naive assumption that one is master of the situation, those who see the illegitimacy of this assumption can nevertheless retrogressively slip into an equivalent blindness associated with the assumption that one can in principle regain mastery of a situation in the wake of an event. In post-tale, metaphorically speaking, this blindness is represented by the queen's assumption that, in order to restore her mastery over the situation, it is imperative, and therefore in principle possible, to re-find the letter. The implicit assumption here is that with the recovery of the document, all will return to how it was in the beginning, as if nothing has happened, as if one could reinstate the past as it was, making nothing of time and of the event. Yet because the letter, precisely because it is an event, irrevocably changes the fabric of the world, there is no proper return of the letter, even if the document is recovered. The queen's delusion, which now mirrors the king's, is to have mistakenly conceived of the letter as synonymous with a physical object. Her misrecognition of the letter is graphically illustrated in post-tale by the irony that, in order to recover it, she resorts to the very mechanisms of law enforcement whose legitimacy it invalidates. Further, the discrepancy between the letter and the document she seeks to recover is highlighted, fittingly, by the prefect's misapplication of instrumental methods in his search for it. Bound by the blindness associated with faith in the metaphysics of presence, the prefect of police, representing the queen slip into the masculine position, knows that something is amiss, unlike the king, but immediately interprets the trouble along the lines of there being some known object that has gone missing from its proper place in the order. As Lacan puts it, what is hidden is never but what is missing from its place, as the call slip puts it when speaking of a volume lost in a library 40. He therefore searches for it on the assumption that it can in principle be refound. Put in other terms, if the letter as event represents the real in contrast with physical reality, the detectives have so immutable a notion of the real that they fail to notice that their search tends to transform it into its object. 41 Lacan associates masculine blindness with what he calls the realist's imbecility, which has two sides. 42 On the one hand, as it pertains to the prefect, such blindness represents his obliviousness to the possibility that, 361 paradoxically, what is seen in the clear light of day, that is, everything that can be made present or established in terms of a certain order of presence, simultaneously exposes and hides the truth in post-story. This is demonstrated by the paradoxical situation of the letter, which is hidden out in the open by someone one step ahead of the prefect. The prefect, then, is duped by the minister, not because he sees nothing amiss, like the king, but because, like the queen, he does not grasp the paradoxical nature of the real but rather relies on the scientific methods that will help you not to think of truths you'd be better off leaving in the dark. 43 Hence Dupin's assessment of the prefect, a certain set of highly ingenious resources are, with the prefect, a sort of Procrustean bed, to which he forcibly adapts his designs. 44. The retrogressive slip from analytical insight to blindness. How does an individual slip from the position of analyst to the position of blindness? Again, this cannot be a matter of returning to the ideological blindness represented by the king, nor can it be a matter of the contradictory belief that refinding the letter will efface the happening of the event, or, that is, negate time. Rather, the blindness here is double, like the queen. Both the minister and Dupin assume that a superior intellect, or the insight that is consequent upon receiving the letter, places a person one step ahead of an adversary and therefore in a position of mastery over the situation. Further, in the cases of the minister and Dupin, this blindness is associated with the assumption that one has achieved mastery over the transgressed other upon receiving and holding the letter, and not only successfully hiding it, like the queen in relation to the king, but also in knowing just how to take advantage of it. But there is another side to the realist's imbecility which Lacan describes as pertaining to those who do not pause to observe that nothing, however deep in the bowels of the earth a hand may seek to ensconce it, will ever be hidden there, since another hand can always retrieve it. 45 This description applies straightforwardly to the masculine ploys of the common criminals who try to hide what is stolen in the most obscure cracks and crevices, and who will never by this means outwit the prefect's mode of searching. But in a paradoxical twist, it applies equally to the feminine ploys of the queen, the minister, and Dupin, all of whom hide the letter out in the open, so outsmarting the king and the police but simultaneously leaving this ploy exposed to those with eyes enough to see it, who may at any point simply stretch out a hand to retrieve it. The assumption of mastery, then, involves a misrecognition of the situation. 362 Since it takes into account only the intellectual prowess of the transgressed. Implicitly, then, all assumptions of mastery are based only on one's assessment of the available evidence, the trouble being that this assessment is in principle never made with a full deck in hand, leaving the assessor permanently exposed to those of equal or greater analytical perspicacity. This means, in the end, that, like the king, the transgressor remains blind to the tricks of those who see more clearly. For example, in playing the part of the one who hides, Lacan notes that the minister first slips from the analytical position that enabled him to purloin the letter in the first place to the feminine position previously occupied by the queen. 46 Here we find that, in holding the letter, a man enough to defy to the point of scorn a lady's fierce admire undergoes to the point of a metamorphosis the curse of the sign he has dispossessed her of. 47 So we find him trapped in the typically imaginary situation whereby he sees that he is not seen by the police. The minister acts as a man who realizes that the police's search is his own defense, since we are told he allows them total access by his absences. 48 But, lulled into the false sense of invincibility afforded by their blindness, he fails to recognize that outside of that search he is no longer defended. 49 In short, he misconstrues the real situation, in which he is seen not seeing by someone who sees further than he. Dupin. 50 What, then, does Dupin grasp that the minister misses? Precisely that in the game of odds and evens, a sharper intellect would expose his ploy. If Dupin in this tale emerges as the mark of a supreme analytical intellect, are we to suppose that this character ought to stand as a model for the analyst, or the psychoanalytically realized subject, in psychoanalytical theory? And if the task of the psychoanalyst is to engender the power of the analyst in the analyzand, does Dupin's method of detection provide a model for analytical interpretation? Clearly not, for it is not fortuitous that Lacan emphasizes the savageness of Dupin's attack on his adversary and alter ego in this tale, the other analyst and his mirror image, whom he labels that monstrum horrendum, an unprincipled man of genius. 51 The implication here is that the aggression is a function of identification and that this act of aggression establishes that Dupin, as much as the minister, deserves the label of monstrum horrendum. Lacan's analysis of Dupin as a character is important because it details his view of the kind of insight that makes for an analyst and what kind of blindness threatens any analyst with the logic of retrogression. Dupin's insight is laid out in the contrast Lacan details between his narration of the second scene in post-tale and the prefect's narration of the first. In constructing the work so that the scenes are narrated by characters 363 occupying different subject positions, Poe offers a comparison between the masculine blindness of the prefect and Dupin's analytical insight insofar as they make opposite use of the powers of speech. Between the two scenes, Lacan notes, a transition is made here from the domain of exactitude to the register of truth. I shall return to the ambiguity of Lacan's notion of truth. Suffice it to note here that at bottom he links truth to the notions of event or trauma as Lee notes, in the Freudian thing, the thing in question here being quite precisely truth. Lacan adopts a Heideggerian account of truth, understanding truth as essentially a state or process of disclosure, but a truth is a particular disclosure, the effect of which is that reality is no longer the same for us as it was before. 52 Truth, by extension, is linked to the recognition of the consequent unavoidability of a rise in any narrative. Accordingly, Lacan calls the first dialogue between the prefect of police and Dupin, and companion, a play without words, suggesting that it is a play unaware of its aporetic literary character. 53 The prefect of police narrates without knowing the conditions of his narration. He simply tells it the way it is. His narration, Lacan notes, takes on the character of a game played as between a deaf man and one who hears. The real complexity of the event certainly emerges in the dialogue, but only for the analyst, here Dupin. Lacan has in mind, for example, the following early exchange between the prefect and Dupin. 54 The prefect begins by contradicting himself. The fact is, the business is very simple indeed, and I make no doubt that we can manage it sufficiently well ourselves, but then I thought Dupin would like to hear the details of it, because it is so excessively odd. This contradiction is at once underscored by Dupin, simple and odd, forcing the prefect to admit his perplexity openly. Why, yes, and not exactly that, either. The fact is, we have all been a good deal puzzled because the affair is so simple, and yet baffles us altogether. Dupin then presses the point by proposing more than once that the truth might lie in paradox, but this is a notion the prefect immediately and automatically dismisses, negates, scoffs at, and renders null. Perhaps it is the very simplicity of the thing which puts you at fault. What nonsense you do talk. Perhaps the mystery is a little too plain. Oh, good heavens. Who ever heard of such an idea? A little too self-evident. Ha. 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 55 The automaticity of his response to a notion beyond the narrow framework of the position from which he speaks, reflected performatively in the repetition of the interchange, like a stuck record, signifies the unconscious repetition compulsion that characterizes his imaginary capture. As Lacan notes, it is as though the highly significant commentary into which he who understands integrates it, could, because unperceived by him who does not understand, be considered null. 56 364 Dupin's narration of the second scene stands in stark contrast to the prefect's mode of speech, by virtue of its evident self-consciousness, as indicated by his lengthy analyses of both the modus operandi of the police and of the minister. He is clearly wise to the conditions of narration that underpin the masculine and feminine subject positions and is aware of how they relate. He is also, at least apparently, aware of the conditions of his own narration, for he describes in erudite detail his own modus operandi. This show of erudition and the easy cunning with which he uses the power of analytical reasoning, a combination of mathematical and poetical genius, to outwit and trick the minister is all but guaranteed to install in the listener, the reader of the tale, the impression that Dupin is the true master of the situation and the hero of the tale. Moreover, this impression is confirmed, it would seem, by the fact that he does not try to hold the letter but exchanges it for a check, thus apparently allowing him to withdraw from the symbolic circuit of the letter. 57 If Dupin sees that he has tricked the minister by the power of his reasoning, and constitutes himself thereby as fully master of the situation, Lacan, however, expresses an early suspicion that there is a certain dissonance between, on the one hand, the admittedly penetrating though, in their generality, not always quite relevant remarks with which he introduces us to his method and, on the other, the manner in which he in fact intervenes. 58 As he puts it, the prophet Dupin so nimbly extracts from his exploit, if its purpose is to allow him to withdraw his stakes from the game, makes all the more paradoxical, even shocking, the partisan attack, the underhand blow, he suddenly permits himself to launch against the minister, whose insolent prestige, after all, would seem to have been sufficiently deflated by the trick Dupin has just played on him. 59 If Dupin occupies the position of analyst by virtue of a certain intellectual knowledge of the conditions of narration, there is nevertheless something troubling about his action, which reminds Lacan of a definition he once gave of the modern hero, whom ludicrous exploits exalt in circumstances of utter confusion as indicated in a footnote. This is a reference to his insistence in function and feel that the kind of psychoanalyst who did not take account of language resembles the type of modern hero famous for his vain exploits in situations entirely beyond his control. In other words, for Lacan, like the analyst who does not take proper account of the conditions of narration, the function of language and its relation to the unconscious, Dupin does not really know what he is doing. Instead, in constituting himself as master analyst, Dupin remains blind to the function of the unconscious, or, that is, the function in the 365 dialogue of his own desire, which, like an undertow, drives the logic of retrogression. It is not simply that his act of revenge undermines the outward impression created that he won the day through the neutral power of reasoning. It is rather that it confirms what is already there to be found symptomatically in his discourse, namely that if winning was the point of employing his analytical prowess, then this prowess serves only his own drive for mastery. Lacan notes the eristic quality of the enigmas, paradoxes, and even jests presented to us as an introduction to Dupin's method. 60 In other words, the games he uses as metaphors for his strategy suggest that it is aimed at winning rather than reaching the truth. The implication is that Dupin is as unconsciously invested as all of the other characters in acquiring power or mastery over the rest. His discourse on his modus operandi, ostensibly a mode of enlightening the reader concerning what it takes to be an analyst, forms a smokescreen of rational neutrality that veils his hunger for power. The solver of enigmas could equally turn out to be an impressive hoax, the august joker who has duped us all into believing that he alone has secured his withdrawal from the symbolic circuit. What could be more convincing, Lacan asks, than the gesture of laying one's cards face up on the table? So much so that we are momentarily persuaded that the magician has in fact demonstrated, as he promised, how his trick was performed, whereas he has only renewed it in still purer form. Lacan thus claims to be more analytically aware than Dupin of the conditions of his narration, for in the symptomatic eruptions just discussed, he can fathom the unconscious motivation, a desire for analytical mastery defined as power over others, that Dupin misses. 61 What Lacan, unlike Dupin, knows as an analyst has to do with the nature of genuine mastery. According to Lacan, in misrecognizing mastery as power over others, what Dupin does not see is that his analytical modus operandi engenders the radically destabilizing situation of odds and evens between adversaries of equal intellectual power. 62 If adversaries are equal, then there is only chance and no longer reason in the game. Dupin, for example, is certain of the minister's downfall or disgrace when he tries to use the letter. For 18 months the minister has had her in his power. She has now him in hers, since, being unaware that the letter is not in his possession, he will proceed with his exactations as if it was. Thus will he inevitably commit himself, at once, to his political destruction. His downfall, too, will not be more precipitate than awkward. 63 But Lacan notes that he has probably underestimated the minister. If he is truly the gambler we are told he is, he will consult his cards a final time before laying 366 them down, and upon reading his hand, will leave the table in time to avoid disgrace and no doubt will begin to plot his revenge. In this case, the intellects are matched and the game devolves into a pessimistic now-in situation of perpetual power struggle. The warning to analysts, of every ilk, that Lacan extracts from Dupin's blindness, therefore, is that genuine mastery cannot be understood in terms of exercising power over others. Rather, what psychoanalysis in principle requires of an analyst, or aims at in any psychoanalytically realized subject, is a form of self-mastery, which is defined as the power of inventive self-renewal through the interminable labor of self-analysis. Concluding remarks, empty speech /full speech and the talking Q. Lacan's seminar on the purloined letter presents the theoretical underpinnings for Lacan's claim that psychoanalytic practice, among other things, should aim to bring analysts into being. Like Socrates, those who are already analysts should serve as self-effacing midwives at the birth of new analysts. Their task, in other words, is to intervene where the death drive in either of its manifestations becomes a disempowering pariah for individuals and to facilitate their progressive shift from the subject positions dominated by imaginary fixations to the position of analyst. To make this shift requires not only the birth of self-consciousness, defined as a progressively achieved insight into the unconscious conditions of narration, but also a grasp of the intersubjective dynamics of the unconscious desire for mastery and the permanent risk this poses of blinding retrogression. These requirements are not restricted to the analytic dialogue but apply generally to ordinary dialogue in any context, precisely because speaking is in principle structured in terms of call and response. As Lacan puts it in another text, in analysis, a subject offers himself as being capable of being understood, and indeed is capable of being understood. 64 That is, a listener is inscribed in the very notion of speech. There is no speech without a reply, even if it is met only with silence, provided that it has an auditor. 65 To speak at all is to place another in the position of analyst or, that is, constitute another individual intersubjectively as the other whom I call upon to recognize my desire. Because of the responsibility consequently conferred on any auditor in her/his capacity as other, dialogue in general is a situation of risk and responsibility, for it is here that the subject comes into being. As Lacan puts it, henceforth the decisive function of my own reply appears, and this function is not, as has been 367 said, simply to be received by the subject as acceptance or rejection of his discourse, but really to recognize him or to abolish him as subject. Such is the nature of the analyst's responsibility whenever he intervenes by means of speech. 66 The risks and responsibilities are magnified in the analytic dialogue because the psychoanalyst is charged with the task of deliberately abolishing and recognizing the analysand as subject, making the analytical dialogue extremely vulnerable to the retrogressive undertow of the analyst's desire for power. Lacan's challenge to the analytic establishment, then, is to make good the claim inscribed in the name psychoanalysis instead of playing the modern hero, where the analysand may be helped despite the analyst, by taking seriously the function of language and its association with power. As he insists, whether it sees itself as an instrument of healing, of training, or of exploration in depth, psychoanalysis has only a single medium, the patient's speech. That this is self-evident is no excuse for our neglecting it. 67 The movement of call and response, according to Lacan, lies at the heart of the function of language in analysis. 68 Further, in accordance with the structuralist division between parole, individual speech or narration, and langue, the conditions of the narration, he divides the analytic dialogue into two parts, the first concerned with the here and now of the analysand's free association and the second focused on the anamnesis or recollection, which makes possible the symbolic interpretation of the analysand's discourse. 69 Within the analytic dialogue, analysands begin by taking the risk of narrating their life stories by means of free association, of saying whatever comes to mind, and the analyst assumes the responsibility of offering an acute, interventionist response, where often enough the intervention takes the form of silence. 70 Initially, speaking about oneself is relatively easy, as Lee notes. For we have ample recourse to the superficial, media-propagated stereotypes by means of which we can avoid a genuine speaking about ourselves. 71 In Lacan's terms, the MOI is a concatenation of unreflectively absorbed or passively received identifications, a caring doctor, an academic, an obsessive-compulsive. However, precisely because the subject is split and the J is in principle in excess of any MOI identifications, Lacan argues that frustration, sometimes coupled with aggression, is the inevitable ultimate consequence of free association. 72 When the J tries, in analysis, to gather the MOI identifications into a coherent narrative, it finds gaps, discrepancies, and contradictions it is ordinarily entirely unaware of. I am a caring doctor, bound by the Hippocratic Oath. I am a shareholder in a private hospital. 73 368 Bearing in mind that analysand seek intervention precisely because of subjective troubles, the analytic dialogue is initially focused on abolishing the analysand as a MOI. While analysands work to weave their narratives into an objectifying coherence, analysts initially work to counter the call for affirming recognition implicit in such self-objectification, in the hope of dismantling the illusion that identity is ever properly captured in any MOI construction. 74 The first insight gained from free association, then, is that all self-identifications are essentially fictional, derived from the alienating misrecognitions of the mirror stage. This insight, in turn, dispossesses analysands of their overt desires, for they come to realize that these have been shaped by various pregiven symbolic systems. It is in this sense that a subject's speech is what Lacan calls empty. The art of the analyst, according to Lacan, is not simply a matter of dissolving paralyzing identifications. Psychoanalysts are also responsible for facilitating the analysand's reconstitution of a more satisfying narrative identity, that is, the reconstitution of a discourse that manifests the analysand's truth. 75 Lacan's notion of truth, as mentioned, is notoriously paradoxical. In his words, the analysand's narrative presents us with the birth of truth in speech, and thereby brings us up against the reality of what is neither true nor false. 76 Recalling his conception of truth as trauma, the effect of which is that reality is no longer the same for us as it was before, one could begin by suggesting that the birth of the analysand's truth occurs in the recognition of her desire. But this involves recognizing both what this desire is and that it lacks. In other words, insofar as the imaginary structures that analysands tend to imitate remain unconscious, their narrative continues to be lived merely as an unreflective, meaningless, unstructured, incomprehensible stream of consciousness. They grasp the truth of their narratives when they see how their actions have been structured by unconscious subject positions and come to grasp the articulation of those structures. 77 This should be a life-changing event whose truth is, in an important sense, still to come. It will be conferred retroactively. Truth, then, in a second sense, is best captured in the oxymoron of a necessary fiction. In other words, a narrative will be true insofar as subjects are ready not only to reject false desires but to recognize true desires and assume them, by taking responsibility for weaving them into a necessary fiction, which is, then, paradoxically, the true story. This activity of reconstitution invokes, as Lee points out, Freud's notion of Nachtraglichkeit or deferred action, in French après-coup, the notion that the meaning and physical effectiveness of early experiences and memories can be and routinely are revised or even constituted for the first time. 369 In the light of later experiences. 78 For Lacan, in short, analysts are charged with the responsibility of facilitating the process whereby analysands come to recognize and assume their desires. In order to free the subject's speech according to Lacan, we introduce him into the language of his desire, that is to say, into the primary language in which, beyond what he tells us of himself, he is already talking to us unknown to himself, and, in the first place, in the symbols of the symptom. 79 Again, in his words, the analytic experience allows us to feel the pressure of intention, the drives. We read it in the symbolic meaning of symptoms, as soon as the subject throws off the defenses by which he disconnects them from their relations with his daily life and his history, in the implicit finality of his behavior and his rejections, in his unsuccessful acts, in the avowal of his privileged fantasies, and in the riddles of his dream life. We can measure it partly in the demanding tone that sometimes underlies his whole discourse, in his unfinished sentences, his hesitations, his inflections and his slips of the tongue, in the inaccuracies of his descriptions of events, irregularities in his application of the analytic rule, late arrivals at sessions, calculated absences, and often in recriminations, reproaches, phantasmic fears, emotional reactions of anger, attempts at intimidation. 80 Analysts, then, help analysands break down fixated desires by intervening at the point of such symptomatic interruptions in the otherwise meaningless flow, or empty speech, of free association. Lacan calls such analytical interventions punctuation breaks. He notes that the absence of punctuation is a source of ambiguity in ancient manuscripts. Moreover, he adds, the punctuation, once inserted, fixes the meaning, changing the punctuation renews or upsets it, and a faulty punctuation amounts to a change for the worse. 81 Just as a punctuation mark retroactively confers sense upon a relatively indeterminate or ambiguous concatenation of words, so careful analytical questions or gestures have the effect of conferring meaning on the analysand's discourse. 82 Through carefully chosen breaks in the associative discourse of their analysans, analysts highlight features of their imaginary MOI identities, allowing them to grasp, for example, the gap between subject and predicate inherent in a statement of the form I am a caring doctor. The analyst's punctuating intervention, then, which has the effect of compelling analysans to clarify something ambiguous and construct a symbolic interpretation of it, brings 370 into existence a signification that, as Lee puts it, was only virtually present in the discourse. 83 For Lacan, the further analytic task involves empowering analysans to construct their own punctuation marks, to take on the responsibility of becoming the J who narrates, punctuates, confers meaning, in short, actively constructs the necessary narrative fiction. Such active interpretation, while a necessary step, however, is not sufficient to transform the empty speech of the analysand into the full speech of the psychoanalytically realized subject. 84 Analysis cannot end at this point, for it is entirely contrary to the spirit of Lacanian psychoanalysis to imagine that its aim is to arrive at any objectifying discourse that simply helps analysans find out anew who they are. Instead, Lacan is persistently at pains to oppose the kind of analysis that leads an analysand to the point of saying I am. In Lacan's words, psychoanalysis may accompany the patient to the ecstatic limit of the thou art, that in which is revealed to him the cipher of his mortal destiny, but it is not in our mere power as practitioners to bring him to that point where the real journey begins. 85 I take him to mean that analysts can help analysans recognize their desires, but, in the same sense that one cannot die for another, analysts cannot relieve analysans of the responsibility involved in assuming them and, thereby, stepping into the aporetic circle. Truth, accordingly, in a third sense, for Lacan, is a matter of recognizing temporality and change, unlike the Queen, who desires to negate time. However, he agrees with Heidegger that understanding one's temporality does not imply an acknowledgement of human finitude in the sense that one is heading toward death 1 minute, day, year at a time. 86 Recognizing truth as temporality, then, is not reducible to the commonplace that we all die, but is a matter of recognizing that any finite identity is a necessary fiction, that the I is always in excess of that fiction, which means that the fiction requires inventive iteration. To recognize temporality is to recognize that the kernel of truth is a traumatic event around which human subjects build their necessary fictions, which are impossible to do without but which remain always to some extent alienating. It is only if one becomes fixated with a particular fiction, and, in this sense, desire to subject time itself to paralysis, that disorders occur. Accordingly, the final part of the analytical task is to engender a recognition in the analysand that the narrative constructed by the J to define the MOI on the basis of events is a necessary fiction that remains permanently open-ended. Just as all events are constituted retrospectively through their narration, nachdrücklich, so the deliberate punctuation mark retroactively confers meaning or truth on a narrative. But punctuation 371 is intrinsically paradoxical. Punctuation continually resolves ambiguities retroactively, only to generate others. 87 This understanding frees the J from the narration and opens it up for reinvention, allowing new strands to weave their way in and perhaps, again retroactively, to throw new light on the existing narrative. As Lacan puts it, in psychological anamnesis, it is not a question of reality, but of truth, because the effect of full speech is to reorder past contingencies by conferring on them the sense of necessities to come, such as they are constituted by the little freedom, the artistic license, through which the subject makes them present. 88 It is clear that for Lacan the psychoanalytically realized subject theorized in his seminar on the purloined letter accords with his later conception of ethical being, defined as the ethical power of inventive sublimation, which marks the apotheosis of human being. The fully realized human subject is one who has achieved such ethical power, which, paradoxically, amounts to an awareness of the persistent responsibility to keep striving for mortal immortality as the appropriately human end. This should not be taken to mean that at any point psychoanalysis produces subjects who can finally claim to be fully realized or ethical. The psychoanalytically realized subject is, paradoxically, one who knows in what sense the task of becoming an analyst is interminable.